That crystal glass cost more than her rent, and it was about to be the last thing he ever drank. She wasn't invited to save his life. She wasn't even invited to the wedding. Some brides walked down the aisle carrying flowers. This one was carrying a secret that would end a dawn. If you believe a stranger's instinct can outrun a room full of guards, comment where you're watching from, I'll come say hello. The cathedral doors are gold-trimmed, guarded by 6 men in black who don't blink. Sujin Park, dressed in a borrowed dress 2 sizes too big, isn't on the guest list. She's staff, refilling water glasses, invisible in the way only hired help is at a mafia wedding. She sees it happen in half a second, the bride's manicured hand, a flick of the wrist, a shimmer dissolving into the groom's wine before he lifts it to his lips. Everyone else sees a bride adjusting her ring. Sujin sees a woman about to become a widow by choice. She doesn't think. She crosses the aisle in 3 steps and slaps the glass out of his hand before it reaches his mouth. Wine hits marble. 200 guests go silent. And Kong Tae-min, the most feared boss in Seoul, turns to look at the woman who just struck him in front of his own family, with no idea she just saved his life. The wind off Lake Michigan didn't blow that winter so much as it hunted. It found the gaps in Maya's coat sleeves, the split seam at her boot heel, the thin place behind her knees where 2 pairs of leggings still weren't enough. 18 years old and she'd already learned the geography of survival in this city, which grates breathed warm air up from the subway, which church basements opened their doors after dark and which ones didn't, which alleys off Lower Wacker held less wind than others. Tonight she'd claimed a stretch of sidewalk behind a shuttered diner, steam curling up from a vent that smelled like old grease and, faintly, of something almost like safety. She had one thing that mattered, a paper cup of vegetable soup, bought with the last $4 she'd earned holding a sign at the off-ramp. It was thin and mostly broth, more onion than anything else, but it was hot, and hot was a kind of wealth out here. She was rationing it. One careful sip every few minutes, cupping it in both hands between swallows to steal the heat before it left her. That was when she heard him. Not a shout. A rasp. Somewhere between a cough and a word, coming from the recessed doorway of the shuttered diner, half swallowed by shadow. She almost walked past it. You learned not to look too closely at things in the dark, sometimes what needed help was actually a trap wearing help's face. But something about the sound stopped her. It wasn't asking for money. It sounded like a man forgetting how to breathe. She found him folded into the doorway like a piece of paper someone had tried to make disappear. An old man, thin coat, no gloves, his hands a color she didn't like at all. His eyes were open, and when they found her, there was no performance in them, no practiced desperation, no old street theater. Just plain, quiet terror. The terror of a body giving up. "Sir," she said, crouching, "hey. Stay with me." He didn't answer. His lips moved but nothing came out except fog. Maya had seen hypothermia before, she'd watched a man 2 blocks from here stop shivering once, which everyone on the street knew was the bad sign, the sign that meant the body had quit fighting. This man was still shivering, hard, uncontrollable, his whole frame shuddering like a struck bell. Shivering was good. Shivering meant there was still a fight in him. She didn't think about it as a decision. That was the strange thing she'd tell herself later, trying to reconstruct the moment, there hadn't been a choice weighed and made. Her body had simply acted, the way you'd pull your hand back from a flame. She knelt down, peeled the plastic lid off her cup, and held it to his mouth. "Small sips," she said. "Come on. It's warm. Just drink." His hands, when they finally came up to help steady the cup, were shaking so badly he nearly knocked it from her grip. She held it for him instead, tilting it slow, watching his throat work. He drank a third of it before his eyes cleared enough to really see her, really register that a stranger was crouched in front of him in the freezing dark, giving away the only hot thing she owned. "No," he rasped, trying weakly to push the cup back toward her. "No, I need you to shut up and drink your soup," she said, and something in his face cracked open into the ghost of a laugh, dry and startled, like he hadn't expected to laugh again tonight. They split it between them, sip for sip, until the cup was empty and the steam had stopped rising, and the two of them sat shoulder to shoulder in a doorway that smelled like old grease, strangers sharing the last warm thing in a 4-block radius. He asked her name. She told him. He didn't offer his in return, and she didn't push. You didn't, out here. Names were currency people spent carefully. His shivering eased, color creeping back into fingers that had gone the color of the sidewalk. He watched her with an attention that felt different from how most people looked at her, not the quick, guilty glance of someone stepping around a problem, and not the predatory interest of the ones who thought a girl alone on the street was an opportunity. He looked at her like he was trying to memorize something. You didn't have to do that, he finally said. I know. Most people wouldn't have. Most people aren't cold enough to understand what it's worth, she said. I am. He was quiet a long moment. Then he reached into the folds of his coat, slow, careful, his hand still not fully steady, and drew out something small, wrapped in a handkerchief gone soft with age. He pressed it into her palm before she could protest. For you, he said. She unwrapped it under the streetlight. A spoon. Tarnished silver, heavier than it looked, the bowl worn smooth like it had been used for decades, the handle etched with some pattern she couldn't make out in the dark, vines, maybe, or letters worn down to suggestion. I can't take this, she said. I don't need. You're not taking it, he said. I'm giving it. There's a difference. He closed her fingers over it with both his hands, and for a moment his grip was surprisingly strong. Keep it somewhere safe. Somewhere close. Do you understand me? Not in a bag. Not somewhere it can be lost or stolen. On you. It's a spoon. It's mine, he said, and something moved behind his eyes that she didn't have a name for yet, grief, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of a man who has carried a weight so long he's forgotten what his shoulders feel like without it. And now it's yours. Someday it might matter more than you think. I know that sounds like the kind of thing an old man says to be dramatic. I promise you it isn't. She should have pressed him. Should have asked what he meant, who he was, why a stranger dying in a doorway was handing off heirlooms like a man settling his affairs. But the cold was creeping back in, and the shelter 3 blocks over closed its doors at 11, and there was only so much a person could carry in a single night, physically, and otherwise. She threaded the spoon's handle onto the shoelace she wore as a makeshift necklace, tucked it under her collar where it sat cold and strange against her sternum, and helped the old man to his feet. There's a shelter on Halstead, she told him. I'll walk you. I have somewhere to go, he said, which she didn't believe for a second, but he was steadier now, and stubborn in the specific way old men get when they've decided the conversation is over. He caught her wrist before she could turn away, gently, nothing threatening in it, and held her gaze with an intensity that made her want to look away and made her unable to. Maya, he said, saying her name for the first time like he was setting it down somewhere it would keep. Thank you. I mean that in a way you can't understand yet. But you will. Then he was gone, moving into the dark at a pace far steadier than a man who'd nearly frozen to death 20 minutes earlier had any business managing, and Maya stood alone in the doorway with an empty soup cup and a stranger's spoon cooling against her chest, and told herself she'd think about the strangeness of it later. She never saw him again. She thought about him more than she expected to, in the years that followed, usually late at night, usually when the spoon shifted against her skin as she slept, a small cold weight that never quite let her forget. 5 years is a long time to carry a promise you don't understand. Long enough to almost stop wondering what it meant. The car that found her outside the community college library on a gray Tuesday afternoon was the kind of black that didn't reflect light so much as absorb it, and it pulled alongside the curb with the unhurried confidence of something that had never once worried about being told to move along. Maya had a backpack full of accounting texts and 11 minutes to catch her bus, and her first read on this situation was simply irritation, some rich idiot double-parked, blocking the crosswalk. Then the rear door opened, and a man in a suit that cost more than her semester's tuition stepped out onto the sidewalk, and something in her chest went very still and very alert, the old street-honed instinct waking up like a struck match. "Maya Lin," the man said. He had a voice built for boardrooms, flat and unbothered, and eyes that catalogued her, coat, shoes, the way she'd already shifted her weight onto the balls of her feet, with professional thoroughness. "My name is Samuel Vance Cross. I'm an attorney. I need you to come with me." "I don't know you," she said, already calculating the distance to the library doors, the crowd of students that would make a scene inconvenient for anyone trying to force the issue. 5 years off the street hadn't dulled the calculations. "They never fully left you." "No," he agreed. "But you knew a man named Arthur. Winter, 5 years ago. A bowl of soup." He watched her face change, and something almost like sympathy crossed his own. "He asked me to find you if anything happened to him." "Something has happened to him. I'm sorry to tell you this way, on a sidewalk, but I need you to understand this isn't a threat, and it isn't a mistake. It's the reading of a will. His will. You're named in it." The bus she was supposed to catch pulled away from the stop half a block down without her. She got in the car. The building downtown had a lobby with ceilings that made her feel like she was standing at the bottom of a well of money, marble and brass, and the particular hush that only exists in places where the air itself has been built for. Samuel Vance Cross walked half a step ahead of her, not so much guiding as accompanying, and said almost nothing in the elevator except to confirm, twice, carefully, that she understood who Arthur Vance had been. She hadn't understood, not really, not until the conference room doors opened onto a table of people who looked at her the way you'd look at something that had wandered in from outside and needed to be removed. Men in suits with the specific stillness of people trained to be dangerous quietly. A woman near the head of the table taking notes with a face carved from ice. And at the far end, standing with his hands braced on the table like he could hold the room down by force of will alone, a man in his late 30s with slicked-back hair and eyes that had already decided exactly what he thought of her. "This is a mistake," the man said, before Samuel had even finished pulling out Maya's chair. "This is, Samuel, tell me this is some kind of joke." "It isn't, Julian," Samuel said, with the weary patience of a man who had clearly had this exact conversation before, likely multiple times, likely with lawyers on retainer specifically to have it. Arthur's instructions were explicit and were filed, witnessed, and notarized 11 months before his death. There is no ambiguity. He gave everything to a. Julian's eyes raked over Maya again, cataloging the thrifted blazer, the backpack still slung over one shoulder, the general fact of a young woman who very obviously did not belong in this room, and Maya watched him decide, in real time, that she was not a threat worth taking seriously, which she understood immediately was a mistake he'd come to regret making. To some girl off the street. He gave the Vance syndicate, my family's legacy, to someone who probably can't spell fiduciary. "I can," Maya said. It was the first thing she'd said since entering the room, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "It means someone who's legally obligated to act in another person's best interest. I imagine we're about to find out whether you know what it means, too." A couple of the suited men at the table did a poor job hiding their reactions. Julian's jaw tightened. Samuel opened a leather folio and began, in the unhurried cadence of a man reading words he'd read aloud many times before, the last will and testament of Arthur Vance. Maya sat very still and listened to her own name recur again and again through language she barely understood, controlling shares, holding companies, private estates, syndicate assets, majority interest, until the shape of what was happening finally assembled itself into something her mind could hold. The old man from the doorway. The old man whose hands had shaken so badly he could barely hold a cup of soup. He had been the most powerful and feared man in the Midwest underworld, and he had died, and he had left every fragment of that empire to her. "There has to be a mistake," she heard herself say, quietly, to no one in particular. "There isn't," Samuel said, not unkindly. "There's a very specific man's very specific intention. I'd advise you to start believing that quickly, Ms. Lin. Some of the people in this room are already deciding how they feel about it. Julian was one of them. He'd gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that in Maya's experience was worse than shouting, and when he finally spoke again his voice had dropped into something low and precise, aimed at her like a blade laid flat against skin. "You have no idea what you've inherited," he said. "You have no idea what it costs to hold what you're now holding. People who touch what's mine without earning it don't get to keep their hands." He straightened his jacket with a small, controlled motion, the gesture of a man reasserting composure he'd nearly lost in front of witnesses. "This isn't over. Whatever paperwork my uncle signed, whatever sentimental fit made him throw his life's work at a stranger, I will be taking back what belongs to my family. You would be wise to disappear back into whatever gutter you came from before that happens." The room had gone very quiet. Maya felt the old street instinct rising in her, the one that catalogued exits and weighed threats and had kept her alive through 5 winters that should have killed her, and underneath it, something new and colder, a refusal to let this man see her flinch. "I gave a dying stranger half a bowl of soup because it was the right thing to do," she said. "I didn't do it for this. I don't want this. But you just threatened me in a room full of witnesses, in front of your family's own lawyer, 30 seconds after finding out I existed. So maybe ask yourself what that says about which one of us actually deserves to be trusted with any of it." Julian's face went the color of old ash. He opened his mouth to answer. And that was the exact moment the doors at the back of the conference room opened without a knock, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark tactical suit stepped through them with the unhurried, absolute authority of someone who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "Ms. Lynn," he said, his eyes flicking once around the room, cataloging threats the way a soldier reads terrain. "My name is Marcus Cole. Arthur asked me, personally, to make sure nothing happened to you today." His gaze settled on Julian for exactly 1 beat too long to be casual. "It looks like I got here just in time." The car Marcus drove was nothing like the one that had collected her that morning, older, unremarkable, the kind of vehicle built to disappear into traffic rather than announce its presence. And he drove it the way he seemed to do everything, with a controlled, economical precision that made Maya understand, without being told, that this was a man who had spent a very long time being very good at keeping people alive. "You're not what I expected," he said, after several miles of silence, his eyes flicking to the mirrors with a rhythm that never quite broke. "What did you expect? Someone more impressed with themselves? Or more afraid?" A pause. "You were neither, in there. That matters more than you know. I've had 5 years of people underestimating me because of what I look like and where I've slept," Maya said. "A man in a suit threatening me isn't the scariest thing that's happened to me this month." Something in Marcus's expression shifted, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "Arthur said you'd be like this." He didn't say it like a compliment, exactly. More like a warning to anyone stupid enough to underestimate you. He glanced at her, and for the first time his voice softened by a degree. "He talked about you. More than you'd think, for a man who only spent 20 minutes with you 5 years ago." Maya's hand went, unconsciously, to the spoon still resting against her chest under her shirt, the same shoelace necklace she'd worn every day since that winter night, replaced twice as the cord wore through but never once removed. Who was he? Really? "That," Marcus said, taking an exit that led away from the glittering downtown skyline and toward the quieter, more anonymous grid of the suburbs, "is a longer conversation. One I think you deserve to have somewhere safer than a moving car in city traffic, with people who might already be looking for a way to finish what almost got started in that boardroom." "Julian." "Julian," Marcus confirmed, and something hard and old moved behind his eyes. "You should know now, before we get where we're going, that what happened in that room wasn't him losing his temper. That was him showing you exactly what he is, because he didn't think you were worth the effort of hiding it. That's a mistake he's going to keep making, and it's the only real advantage you're going to have over him for a while. Don't waste it." The house Marcus eventually pulled up to gave nothing away from the street. A modest, well-kept property tucked into a quiet suburban cul-de-sac, indistinguishable from its neighbors except for the discreet cameras angled at every approach and a reinforced door that Marcus unlocked with a sequence of code and biometric scan that took longer than any ordinary front door had a right to. Inside, though, the house told a different story. The furniture was simple, almost monastic, but the walls held things that didn't belong in an off-grid safe house. A scattering of old photographs, curling at the edges, and in the center of the main room, mounted with obvious care, a framed strip of faded blue fabric that meant nothing to Maya and everything, clearly, to the room it hung in. "Sit," Marcus said, gesturing to a worn leather chair by the window, and for the first time since the boardroom his controlled composure cracked slightly, revealing something more tired underneath. The look of a man about to hand over a weight he'd carried alone for a very long time. "I'm going to tell you who Arthur Vance really was. And I need you to understand that everything I'm about to say is true, even the parts that sound impossible." Maya sat. Outside, the wind moved through bare branches with a sound not unlike the wind she remembered from that winter doorway, 5 years and a lifetime ago. "Arthur built the Vance syndicate from nothing over 4 decades, Marcus began. Not the polite version people tell at charity dinners, the real thing. Money, territory, fear, all of it, built brick by a man who was better at this than anyone alive. And then, 6 years ago, his own blood tried to bury him for it." Julian. "Julian," Marcus confirmed. "A coup. Quiet, careful, almost bloodless, which is its own kind of brutal, when you understand what almost cost. Arthur survived it, technically. Lost his seat, his protection, most of what he'd built. Went into hiding to keep what was left of it, and what was left of himself. Out of Julian's hands while he decided what to do next." He paused. "The night you found him in that doorway wasn't an old man having a bad winter, Maya. That was 5 days after someone Julian sent finished the job the coup hadn't. Arthur had been poisoned. He'd made it 2 miles on foot before his body started shutting down, and he was 1 hour, maybe less, from dying alone in the cold when you crouched down and put a cup." The spoon sat on the kitchen table between them under a lamp Marcus had angled like an interrogation light, and Maya turned it over in her fingers the way she had 1,000 nights before, except this time she was actually looking instead of just holding. "He told me to keep it close," she said. "Not in a bag. On me. I always thought that was just an old man being sentimental about the last thing he'd ever give away." "Arthur wasn't sentimental about anything he could weaponize instead," Marcus said, sliding a jeweler's loupe across the table to her. "Look at the underside of the bowl. Where the patina's thickest." She turned it, angled it under the light, and pressed the loupe to her eye the way he showed her. For years the tarnish there had looked like nothing more than age, a dark, uneven cloud where silver met air met decades. Now, with the lamp raking sideways across the metal, she could see what the shadow had been hiding, a pattern too regular to be corrosion. Fine lines, deliberate, cut by something far more precise than a jeweler's hand tool. Letters. Numbers. A sequence that repeated in a way random tarnish never would. "That's not damage," she breathed. "That's engraving." "Laser cut," Marcus confirmed. "Old enough now that oxidation's grown over it, which is exactly why nobody's ever noticed. Including you, and you've stared at that spoon every day for 5 years. Arthur had it done by a man who used to make cold storage hardware keys for banks that didn't trust digital security even before it was fashionable not to. That sequence isn't decoration, Maya. It's a key. The kind you can't hack, can't phish, can't force out of someone with a threat, because it only exists as physical metal. You either hold it in your hand, or you don't have it at all." "A key to what?" Marcus's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him, she watched him hesitate before answering. "Arthur kept a vault. Not the kind with a number on a bank statement, the kind that doesn't officially exist. Underneath the city, accessible through 3 buildings that all look, on paper, like nothing more than parking garages and old freight tunnels. Money, records, leverage he'd spent 40 years accumulating on everyone who ever tried to cross him. He never told me the access sequence. He never told anyone. I always assumed he'd die with it, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who trusted the ground more than he trusted people. He nodded at the spoon in her hand. I think he decided, that winter, that there was exactly one person on earth he trusted enough to hold it instead. Maya looked down at the tarnished silver, suddenly heavier in her palm than it had any physical right to be. He picked me before he even knew if I'd survive the week. He picked you because you already had, Marcus said quietly. Whatever kept you alive on those streets for as long as it did, that's the same thing he was betting his life's work on. He wasn't wrong. The entrance Marcus led her to 2 nights later didn't look like the entrance to anything. A rolling steel door in an unremarkable parking structure 11 blocks from the glass tower where Julian now held court, flanked by concrete pillars stained the color of every other concrete pillar in the city. Marcus worked a hidden panel until a secondary door, thinner and better hidden, ground open into a service corridor that smelled of cold air and older machinery than the building above it had any business housing. 2 syndicate captains still loyal to Arthur know this place exists, Marcus murmured as they descended. One of them's dead. The other's been quiet since the funeral, which worries me more than if he'd picked a side out loud. He stopped at a final door. Thick, reinforced, a keypad built into its face beside a small brushed steel receptacle exactly the size and shape of a spoon's handle. This is the part where we find out if I'm right about what that thing actually does. Maya slotted the spoon's handle into the receptacle with hands that weren't quite steady. For a long moment nothing happened, the silence in the tunnel pressing in close enough to hear her own pulse. Then a low mechanical hum rose from somewhere deep in the wall, and a green light bloomed across the keypad, and the door released with a sound like a held breath finally let go. Inside was not the movie vault stacks of cash Maya had half-braced for. It was smaller, colder, more clinical, server racks humming behind reinforced glass, a bank of drives, a single terminal glowing faint blue in the dark. Marcus moved to it with the ease of a man who'd clearly imagined this moment before, and Maya stood at his shoulder as line after line of encrypted records began to unspool across the screen. It took 40 minutes to find what neither of them had been looking for, exactly, but both of them had been dreading. A file, dated 5 years and 11 months back, 6 months before that winter night in the doorway, logged under a name Maya recognized instantly. Julian's private security contractor, a man Marcus identified with a single flat curse. Payment records. A substance procured through an intermediary in Milwaukee, untraceable by design, the kind of slow-acting compound meant to look, to any doctor who examined the body, like an old man's heart simply giving out under the ordinary strain of age. And beneath it, a second file, more recent, time-stamped only weeks before Arthur's actual death. Detailing a follow-up contract with the same contractor, a second, more direct attempt, executed at last after 5 years of Arthur staying hidden, wary, and just careful enough to survive the first attempt's failure to kill him outright. He tried twice, Maya said, very quietly, staring at the screen. The night I found him in that doorway wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a coincidence. Julian poisoned him once, Arthur nearly died in the cold trying to survive it, and I happened to be the person who kept him alive long enough to fail the plan. And then Julian just waited. 5 years. And finished it anyway. The second Arthur let his guard down. This is more than a family grudge, Marcus said, his voice gone very flat and very dangerous. This is premeditated murder, twice attempted, once successful, with a paper trail leading directly to Julian's own contractor. If this ever reaches federal prosecutors intact, then Julian doesn't just lose the syndicate, Maya finished. He goes to prison for the rest of his life. She looked at the glowing terminal, at the weight of everything it held, and felt something settle inside her that was colder and steadier than fear. Copy everything. Every file, every timestamp, every dollar. If Julian's willing to poison his own blood twice to sit in a chair he thinks he's owed, he's not going to hesitate to come for me the same way. I want to be ready long before he decides it's time. She should have listened to her own warning sooner. It happened on a Thursday, on the stretch of expressway that ran the convoy between the safe house and the downtown offices Maya had reluctantly agreed to start visiting twice a week, under Marcus's insistence that the syndicate's captains needed to see her present, unafraid, and in control. 2 cars, 4 of Marcus's most trusted men, a route that changed every single time specifically so it couldn't be predicted. It was ambushed anyway. The first sign was a delivery truck that shouldn't have been merging where it merged, cutting across 3 lanes with a precision that had nothing to do with bad driving and everything to do with timing. Marcus swore and hauled the wheel hard right a half second before the truck would have broadsided them, and the world dissolved into noise. Metal on metal, the pop of gunfire from a second vehicle that had been trailing them for longer than either of them had noticed, glass spraying across the back seat as Maya threw herself down below the window line the way 5 winters of instinct had trained into her without her ever once having to think about it. "Down, stay down," Marcus barked, cutting the wheel again, running 2 wheels up onto the median as he forced a gap between lanes of frozen traffic that hadn't existed a second before. Behind them, the trailing car matched the move, gaining. Someone in the second convoy vehicle was on the radio, voice tight and urgent, calling for backup that felt, in that moment, impossibly far away. They lost the trailing car 11 minutes later, in a parking structure Marcus clearly knew well enough to navigate at speed with his lights off, cutting the engine in a service bay 2 levels below street traffic and sitting in ringing silence while both of them caught their breath. "That wasn't opportunistic," Marcus said finally, once his hands had stopped shaking enough to check the damage to the car. "That truck knew our timing to the minute. Our route changes every trip. I said it myself, an hour before we leave, and I only tell the driver and 1 other person." His face had gone the color of old ash. "Which means somebody inside my own circle is telling Julian where we're going to be before we've even finished deciding it." "A leak," Maya said. "A leak I trusted with Arthur's life for 15 years, Marcus said, and for the first time since she'd met him, she heard something that sounded almost like grief underneath the anger. "Which means from this second forward, we don't trust anyone completely. Not the captains. Not the guards. Not even people who've never given us a single reason to doubt them, because clearly that isn't enough anymore." He looked at her, hard and steady despite the tremor still working through his hands. "Julian's done waiting for you to make a mistake. He's decided to make his own. That means the next move has to be ours, and it has to be final, because I don't think we get a third chance at surviving one of his." The message Maya sent out that night wasn't a threat. It read, to anyone intercepting it, like exactly what it claimed to be, an emergency meeting of the full syndicate council, called for midnight, mandatory attendance, no explanation given. She knew, sending it, that if there truly was a leak among Marcus's trusted circle, Julian would hear about the meeting within the hour, and she was counting on it. The boardroom at the top of the glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan filled slowly through the last hour before midnight, captains and lieutenants taking their seats with the wary uncertainty of men who'd learned, over 5 years of instability, to expect trouble whenever they were summoned without warning. Maya sat at the head of the table where Arthur once had, the spoon a small, steady weight beneath her collar, a laptop open in front of her that most of the room assumed was nothing more than notes. Julian arrived at 7 minutes past midnight, and he did not arrive alone. 6 of his own men flanked him as he entered, and Maya watched the room's temperature drop as every captain present understood, in the same instant, exactly what was happening. Julian didn't bother with pretense. "This ends tonight," he said, and one of his men produced a folder and a pen, sliding both across the table toward her with the flat finality of a man who'd already decided how the evening would end. "Sign the transfer. Every share, every account, everything my uncle stole from his own bloodline and handed to a stranger off the street. Sign it, and you get to walk out of this building breathing. Refuse, and we discover exactly how much your captains actually value a girl they've known for 3 weeks over a family name they've served for 20 years. Every eye in the room went to the folder, and then to Maya, and she understood, in that silence, that Julian had gambled everything on the certainty that fear would do the rest of his work for him. "You poisoned your own uncle," Maya said instead, not touching the pen. twice. The first attempt failed because I happened to be a homeless girl who gave a dying stranger half a bowl of soup on the worst night of his life, and you spent 5 years waiting to finish what that soup interrupted. A ripple moved through the room, captains exchanging glances, the first real crack of uncertainty breaking across faces that a moment before had looked ready to watch her sign whatever Julian put in front of her. I have the payment records. Your contractor's name. Both attempts, dated and timestamped, pulled directly from a vault only Arthur and I ever had access to. Julian's composure slipped for the first time, something raw and furious flashing behind his eyes. You're bluffing. Check your accounts, Maya said, and typed a single command into the laptop in front of her, the sequence Marcus had spent the last 2 nights helping her build, keyed to the spoon's cryptographic signature and nothing else, designed to move the instant she needed it to. Across the room, 3 of Julian's own men went for their phones as alerts began firing in rapid succession, funding streams he'd spent weeks quietly diverting toward this exact confrontation freezing in real time, accounts he'd been counting on to buy loyalty in this room going suddenly, irreversibly dark. You son of a, Julian's hand moved toward his jacket, and the room's temperature dropped again, sharper this time, as 2 of his own men shifted their weight in a way that suggested even they weren't entirely certain what he was reaching for. Don't, Marcus said quietly from the doorway, where he'd been standing, unnoticed, for the last several minutes, flanked by 4 captains who had made their choice the moment they'd watched the accounts freeze. It's already over, Julian. You just haven't caught up to it yet. Maya typed a second command. The wall screen behind her, installed, ironically, for Julian's own presentations to the board, flared to life with an audio file pulled from the same vault, a recording made months earlier from a wire Arthur's last loyal captain had worn without either brother ever knowing, capturing Julian's own voice in cold, unmistakable detail, discussing payment for a compound designed to look like natural heart failure, discussing the timeline for finishing what an interrupted winter attempt had failed to complete. It played to the entire room, and then, a moment later, Maya confirmed with a final keystroke, to a federal prosecutor's office already primed by weeks of Marcus's quiet outside work to receive exactly this kind of evidence the instant it surfaced. The silence that followed was total. You don't get to decide what happens to me now, Julian said, but his voice had lost its edge, gone thin and disbelieving, a man watching the floor disappear from beneath him in real time. You're right, Maya said, standing at last, and for the first time that night she let the exhaustion of the last 3 weeks show plainly on her face, because there was no longer any reason to hide it. I don't. The federal agents who were already on their way up here do. She looked around the table, at captains who'd spent 5 years serving a family name out of habit and fear rather than loyalty, and softened, just slightly. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm not interested in becoming the next version of what almost got me killed twice in 3 weeks. What I am interested in is making sure nobody else ever has to sit at this table wondering if the man across from them is planning to poison his own blood for a chair. That's the last decision this council is ever going to have to make under those terms. The federal agents who arrived 20 minutes later took Julian out through the same gilded lobby where Maya had first been summoned 3 weeks earlier, and this time it was his hands, not hers, cuffed in front of witnesses who understood, watching him go, exactly how completely the balance of power in that building had shifted. The weeks that followed moved faster than Maya had time to fully absorb. Federal prosecutors, working from the evidence pulled out of Arthur's vault, built a case airtight enough that Julian's attorney stopped pretending a trial was survivable and began negotiating instead for the smallest possible sentence a double-attempted murder charge could carry. The syndicate's criminal arms. The extortion rings, the illegal contracts, the decades of quiet corruption Arthur had built and never fully escaped, Maya dismantled methodically over the following months, with Marcus and a legal team Samuel Vance assembled working around the clock to convert what could be salvaged into legitimate holding companies and to sever, cleanly and permanently, everything that couldn't. What remained, once the smoke cleared, was staggering in a way Maya still hadn't fully let herself feel. Legitimate assets worth more than she could comfortably hold in her mind at once, real estate scattered across the city, and, buried in Arthur's private files, dated only a week before his death, as though he'd known exactly how this would end and had written the instructions specifically for the moment she'd finally be free to read them, a single handwritten note. You gave me warmth when you had none to spare. Don't build a fortress with what I'm leaving you. Build a fire big enough that no one in this city ever has to freeze in a doorway waiting for a stranger to notice them. That's the only inheritance I actually want to leave behind. The Vance Foundation broke ground on its first shelter 8 months later, on a lot 2 blocks from the diner where a shivering old man had once pressed a tarnished spoon into an 18-year-old's hands and told her, without either of them understanding it yet, that it might someday matter more than she thought. Maya stood at the ribbon cutting in a coat that fit her properly for the first time in years, watching construction crews finish a building that would house, feed, and educate more kids like the one she used to be than she could yet count, and felt the spoon's familiar, worn weight settle against her collarbone, exactly where she'd carried it every single day since a doorway, a cup of soup, and a promise she hadn't understood had quietly rewritten the entire rest of her life. Marcus found her there afterward, watching the last of the construction lights flicker off as the building's own lit sign came on for the first time, the Vance Foundation, spelled out in warm, steady light against the winter dark. He'd be glad, Marcus said simply. Not about any of the violence, or the war. About this. This is the part he actually wanted. I know, Maya said, and for the first time in months, standing in the exact stretch of cold where her whole life had quietly turned, she let herself simply feel proud instead of braced for whatever came next. I think he knew it the second I gave him half my soup. He just had to wait 5 years to find out if he was right about me.